Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Hello everyone and welcome to Dharma Bum Basics. Today is part 2 of a some number part series, at least 8 parts, on the Eightfold Path. Tonight we'll be talking about right resolve or right intention. So last week we talked about right view and how right view in essence is a working understanding or a functioning understanding of the Four Noble Truths, not just as objective truths, but as categories of perception. And then this week with right resolve in many ways is an extension of right view. So you have right view being this understanding of the Four Noble Truths. But it's one thing to understand something, and another thing to actually have the resolve to put it into practice. So right resolve is taking this understanding and applying it to your own mind, applying it to the analysis of the mind to determine what kind of mind states are unskillful versus which kind of mind states are skillful. So I'm just checking sound quality real quick. Okay, cool. So what's meant by a skillful and unskillful resolve? What are the things that qualify as such, right? So with right resolve, we have basically 3 unskillful resolves that the Buddha focuses on and 3 skillful resolves. The unskillful resolves are being resolved or intent on sensory passion, on ill will, and on harmfulness. So sensory passion, which I'll mention all of the time, um, typically translated as sensual passion, but I don't like that translation because it feels limited. Um, or sensory obsession. And it's basically the obsessive neurotic planning about fulfilling a sense desire. It's not the sense desire itself, but it's the obsession with it. It's not that it's bad to go throughout the day and do things that feel good. It's that when so much of your time is taken up with the obsessive fantasizing about fulfilling these things, many of which are unfulfillable, tends to lead to suffering and tends to lead to unskillful behavior, tends to lead us to things more often than not doing things that we regret, things of that nature. And when the Buddha uses the word passion, he's using it in a context more of how we would think of a crime of passion, that kind of intense emotional surge and obsessiveness. No one really wants that kind of passion, the kind of passion that leads someone to murder someone else. So that's more of the framework that the Buddha is viewing the term passion. And then you have ill will, which is simply wishing others to be deprived from happiness. And then you have harmfulness, which is kind of just a more active ill will. It's you have this ill will, which is wishing others to be deprived of their happiness. And then harmfulness, which is having the desire yourself to go deprive other people of their happiness, to cause harm. And then we have these three skillful desires, which are, or skillful resolves, which are intended as kind of a counterbalance to that. And that's resolve on renunciation, on goodwill, and on harmlessness. So renunciation is kind of this this ability to let go of things that no longer serve you, and also to set aside something that gives you a limited sense of ease if you see that it's getting in the way of a deeper sense of ease. So if we have something, if we have an activity that we enjoy doing, and we can get obsessed and we can invest so many hours into it, and it gives us some enjoyment, but once we're done with that activity or that preoccupation afterwards, we don't feel so great. We kind of feel weighed down. We kind of feel hollow because that activity, although it was fleetingly fulfilling, didn't really build up anything in us. And all of that time that we spend trying to maintain this preoccupation that gives us this fleeting sensation is time that could be spent developing something more worthwhile, something deeper, something that gives us a lasting sense of ease and contentment. So that's renunciation. Being able to, it's that wisdom factor of being able to determine if something's really worth the effort and energy that's put into it, or if that effort and energy is better put somewhere else. So, yeah. And then goodwill is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, if you haven't tuned into Alex's classes on Wednesday night, I'd highly suggest doing so. Metta or goodwill, loving kindness is always the topic. And in essence, goodwill is just this heartfelt wish for others to find true happiness, not by cheating anyone else, or not by, if someone's harmful in their actions, and that brings them some sense of joy. That's not what you're wishing when you're wishing them to be truly happy. You're wishing them to wake up to the causes of true happiness and to develop them. And true happiness doesn't take anything from anyone else. So, in many ways, when you're wishing goodwill for someone who's harmful, you're wishing for them to stop being harmful. And then the last of these skillful resolves is harmlessness. And harmlessness um, is not only abstaining from causing harm in our thoughts, with our thoughts, our words, and our deeds, but it's also on a deeper level, harmlessness, to this wish to avoid causing anyone pain, can develop into compassion, can evolve into compassion, to where you take a more active role when you see there's something that can be done, that's within your power to be done to help someone ease their suffering. You have the desire, the motivation, and the drive to do that. I'll talk a little bit more about them after the meditation. I already talked a bit more than I was expecting out the gate. But the one thing that I do want to mention before we start this meditation, the reason I went over these 6 qualities here, is that, and I'll read this after the meditation, but there's a sutra called the Two Sorts of Thinking, or Two Types of Thinking, where the Buddha first recounts when he decided to start dividing his thoughts into skillful and unskillful. And it was that idea, that concept, that in that very same night led him to full awakening, full freedom. So it can be really helpful in the meditation when you have thoughts come up to not just try to push the thoughts down or immediately dismiss them, but to just softly look at the thought and pose the question in the mind, skillful or unskillful? Does this lead to my own affliction? Does this train of thought lead to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both? Or is this thought a skillful thought? It leads not to my own, nor in others, nor both of our affliction. Does it cloud the mind, or does it promote clear seeing? Does it steady the heart or make the heart tremble? Just checking these things as they arise in the meditation. not getting super analytical into your thoughts, but just simply when a thought when a thought arises, we can acknowledge that it's either we can make a note, skillful, unskillful, and then we can return to the present moment awareness, the breath. But it's really helpful to begin to acknowledge that our thoughts tend to fall into one of these two categories and to notice with time what our tendency is towards so we can start to correct course if need be. So that's all I'll say before we get started. We can go right on into the meditation. If you're new to meditation, it's helpful to have feet flat on the ground. Um, if you're sitting in a chair, if you're on a cushion, do your thing. But if you're sitting in a chair, helpful to have feet flat on the ground, not fully utilizing the backrest as you're more likely to fall asleep if you do. I like to have the tongue pressed up against the roof of the mouth, gently against the back of the teeth, which prevents the buildup of saliva, which can become distracting. I like to bring the shoulders up and back and then relax down into a really sturdy posture. And with that, we'll get started. Closing the eyes and taking 3 deep breaths slowly. Noticing if deep breathing feels good. And if it does, you can keep on breathing in this way. If it doesn't, you can switch things up. Maybe even deeper still or more shallow, heavier or lighter. In long and out short, or in short and out long. Just noticing what feels best for the body in this moment. And this experimentation with the rhythm and texture of breath is really valuable. It gives us some firsthand experience with one of the ways in which we fabricate our experience of the present moment, the way that we breathe. But if this seems too involved for you today, you can just pose the question in the mind as to what type of breathing would feel the most energizing or calming, and then just watch how the body responds. And once the breath feels comfortable, appropriate for the moment, you can allow it to expand, to fill your entire field of awareness. To fill your bodily awareness. Just gradually expanding until there's no distinction between the breath and your awareness. with breath as awareness and awareness as breath. You can notice any tension that you're holding in the body, all the way through the in breath and all the way through the out breath. Softening the forehead and the eyes, dropping the shoulders as well. And if any thoughts come into the mind, you can label them, whether it's skillful or unskillful. And then you can relax into it and return to this body scanning breath. with this excess tension in the body relaxed. You can once again take 3 deep breaths slowly. Taking the next few moments in silence to reflect back on this past session, reflecting back on the quality of the thoughts that arose, whether they were generally skillful or generally unskillful. And you're reminding yourself that whether they were skillful or unskillful, you have no obligation to identify with them as yours. They're not your thoughts, they're thoughts that arise, thoughts that have arisen. Just because you had bad thoughts doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person. Just because you had good thoughts doesn't mean you're a good person necessarily. You're just a person who's having thoughts. With that thought in mind, you can slowly open the eyes and stretch as necessary. So, if, as always, if anyone would like to share how that experience of meditation was for them, feel free to do so. I'm always interested to hear. I let it, I was going to say, I led it a little bit differently tonight, but I tend to always lead it a little bit differently. Um, but I changed something up that I usually have fairly constant, and that was the way we ease into perceiving breath and awareness as one fluid thing instead of two separate things. And that shift in perception can cause a shift in experience. And normally, the instruction that I give is something along the lines of question what perception you hold of the breath and of awareness. Do you perceive them as two separate things? What would happen if you perceived them as one thing? But the way that we did it tonight was more of let the breath expand until it fills your awareness, until there's no distinction between your breath and your awareness. So tending intending to accomplish the same thing, but with a different approach, because different approaches work for different people. And I'm always saying that it's important to have a sense of ingenuity with this practice, to not get stale or robotic with the instructions, but to apply the understanding that we gain from this practice and use some resourcefulness to gear it more towards what works for our own mind. So hopefully that was helpful to some who maybe struggled with the other way of doing it. Yeah. With that type of meditation, or generally with the types of meditation that I lead, we're trying to implement the different ways that we create our experience of the present moment, the different ways we fabricate this experience of the moment. And one of them, as I mentioned in the meditation, is the way that we breathe. Our rhythm, our texture of breath changes how we experience things that happen to us. If we go into a situation that's like mildly annoying, but our breath is erratic, we'll very quickly perhaps have a panic attack, an anxiety attack. If we go into a mildly annoying situation and our breathing is really calm, we're more likely to brush it off. We might still have a slightly less intense panic attack. So the way that we're breathing has this heavy impact on how we experience the things that happen in our lives. And the same goes for our perceptions. Whatever perceptions that we hold deeply influence how we interact with the world. So that suggestion of making breath and awareness one thing is just one example of playing with perception, seeing if we can intentionally adopt a different perspective, a different perception, and noticing the impact that that slight shift in perception has in our experience of the present moment. So that's the intended purpose behind that. So for those of you who are just tuning in, tonight we're talking about right resolve or right intention. I mentioned at the beginning that after the meditation, I would read a little bit. Typically in this class, I read a little bit of a sutra or a sutta, which is the words of the Buddha or some of his closest disciples. And this one is called the Sutra on the Two Sorts of Thinking. And it's very closely related to right resolve and also right effort. And you'll notice that if you're familiar with the path, you'll notice the kind of the tints of right effort in there as well. So I won't read the whole thing, but the whole thing is linked down below if you'd like to read it afterwards. It's just like 2 solid pages, and I don't want to spend all that time reading it. It's more beneficial probably to read it for yourself. And I also, if I can find it, I have a video where I read through it section by section and described or gave commentary on each section of it. Yeah, so I'll link that down below if I can find it. So this sutra is about the first time that the Buddha had the idea of dividing his thoughts into 2 kinds of thoughts, skillful and unskillful. And this is one of my favorite sutras because it goes from that idea that occurs to him, that insight that occurs to him, and it goes through the beginnings of that insight all the way to his total liberation, his total freedom, to highlight how being able to divide your thoughts into skillful and unskillful is at the core of the practice. It's at the core of the Buddha's awakening. So this is the Buddha, not me, just to clarify. Before my self-awakening, when I was still just an unawakened bodhisattva, the thought occurred to me, why don't I keep dividing my thinking into 2 sorts? So I made thinking imbued with sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness one sort, and thinking imbued with renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness another sort. And as I remained thus heedful, ardent, and resolute, thinking imbued with sensory passion, ill will, or harmfulness arose in me. I discerned that it had arisen in me, and that it leads to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to both. It obstructs discernment and does not lead to freedom. As I noticed this, it subsided. Whenever thinking imbued with sensory passion, ill will, or harmfulness had arisen, I simply abandoned it, dispelled it, and wiped it out of existence. Just as in the last month of the rains, in the autumn season when the crops are ripening, a cowherd would look after their cows. He would check and curb them with a stick because he foresees flogging or imprisonment if he let his cows wander in to and feed on the crops. In the same way, I foresaw in unskillful qualities, drawbacks, dangers, and defilement, and I foresaw in skillful qualities rewards related to renunciation and promoting clear seeing. So that's the first part of that. Um, and what I like about this, and you'll notice that there's a little bit of right effort in there as well, if you're familiar. So he starts off with talking about dividing the thoughts into um, sensory passion, ill will, harmfulness, and renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness, which is right resolve. And then he goes into whenever these unskillful qualities arose in him, he would abandon them, dispel them, and wipe them out of existence. And it was through contemplating their drawbacks, as he put it, um, I had discerned that it had arisen in me, and it leads to my own affliction or the affliction of others or both. That's him realizing the drawbacks of that line of thinking, realizing where that line of thinking leads to an unpleasant destination. So, and then he gives the example of the cowherd having to watch very carefully over his cows so that they don't wander into the crops and feed on the crops, and then he gets in trouble for not maintaining his cows. And that image is related to how we work with the mind. If we just let these unskillful qualities run rampant, we tend to more often than not lead ourselves to ruin, lead ourselves to do things that we have regrets about, that we feel shame about, things like that. So it's this quality of when we've noticed these unskillful resolves arise in the mind, we're very quick, we're very meticulous in trying to undo them by really recollecting where they've led us in the past. We can go through our checklist of why we don't want to follow any certain strain of thought. I'm sure we all have our bulletin points, right? Uh, so it's this quality of reflecting back, reflecting on the drawbacks, and then educating the mind that really likes to forget that these things lead us to unpleasant places because it feels good to indulge in them while we indulge in them, but rarely afterwards. So that's that cowherd watching the cows carefully, watching the mind carefully and steering it away from doing something unskillful. And then the second part of this that I'll read is how he dealt with skillful qualities that arose. And as I remained heated, ardent, and resolute, thinking imbued with renunciation, goodwill, or harmlessness arose in me. I discerned that it had arisen in me, and that it leads neither to my own affliction, nor to others, nor to both. It fosters discernment, promotes a lack of confusion, and leads to freedom. If I were to think and ponder in line with that all day and night, I do not envision any danger that would come from it, except that pondering for a long time would tire the body and the mind. So I steadied my mind right within, settled, unified, and concentrated it, so that my mind would not be disturbed. Whatever one keeps pursuing with their thinking and pondering, that becomes the inclination of their awareness. Their mind is bent by that thinking. Just as in the last month of the hot season, when all the crops have been gathered into the village, a cowherd would look after his crops while resting under the shade of a tree or out in the open. He simply keeps himself mindful of those cows. In the same way, I simply kept myself mindful of those qualities. So you can see the distinction here. When the unskillful qualities arose in the mind, there was um, this reaction to wanting to tend the mind back towards skillful qualities, wanting to prevent that line of thinking from flowering because he knew where it would lead to from past experience. But when skillful qualities arise in the mind, pleasant qualities, the only duty is to allow them to be there. You don't have to try, you don't necessarily in that moment have to try to perfect them or try to um, gear them in a very specific way. You just allow them to be there and rest in that equanimity of skillful qualities being present in the mind. You allow yourself to rest with them, be in them, because by doing that, you're also kind of telling the mind that these are qualities that you want to identify with, that you want to allow and allow to blossom in whatever way they will. There's a lot less of an active role in that because there's not any danger associated with them. As the Buddha stated, I could ponder this day and night and it wouldn't lead to anywhere unskillful. Where with an unskillful quality, you ponder it day and night and you whip yourself up into a frenzy. The only drawback, which I like the kind of sense of humor there, is the mind might get a bit tired by all that thinking. So that's the way that the Buddha dealt with those two qualities, the skillful and unskillful qualities. And then the last part I'll read, and he mentions that persistence was aroused in him and his mindfulness became established and he entered into a deep state of meditation because he just allowed those skillful qualities to be there and he allowed himself to rest in that experience, not trying to accomplish anything or maintain anything, just resting in that experience with those skillful qualities gave rise to this really calm state of mind, this really centered state of mind. And then when the mind became solid and steady, I directed it to the knowledge of the ending of the effluence. I discerned at it as it had come to be that this is stress, this is the cause of stress, this is the end of stress, this is the way leading to the end of stress. My heart, thus knowing, thus seeing, was released from sensuality, released from becoming, released from ignorance. With release, there was knowledge released. So, this sutra is about how just dividing the thoughts was enough when developed and pursued, and knowing how to, not just dividing them, but knowing how to interact with each of them, with the unskillful qualities being very active in abandoning them, and then with the skillful qualities being more passive and resting in them. And with those two sets of skills, this led the Buddha all the way to freedom. So that's kind of right resolve. Yeah. And again, the whole sutra is down there if you'd like to read through the other knowledges he got and all of that. And yeah. And there's also a study guide and a link to the playlist. The only thing on there right now, though, is Right View, but the Eightfold Path playlist will be linked below too. So we've got some comments over here. Hello, Marcel. It's good to see you, or good to internet with you. Um, so Katie, this is a very helpful recap before we start. I'm glad that it was helpful. And then Eric asked a question regarding skillful versus unskillful. What about neutral? My mind often wanders to remembering interactions or imagining scenarios, or just wandering about stuff without a strong emotion attached. So, one way of approaching this, there's potentially many ways of approaching it. And if you ask different facilitators, they'll give you different answers. Ask different practitioners, they'll give you different answers. The way that I look at it is I kind of broaden how I perceive unskillful. So, a skillful quality is anything throughout our day. Yes, there's neutral qualities, um, but within the meditation, there's really just thoughts and qualities of mind that help you focus on what you're doing, and thoughts and qualities of mind that take you away from the focus on what you're doing. So, I consider a skillful quality within the meditation. A skillful quality is any kind of mind state that's relating to whatever the object of meditation is, right? So with breath as the example, because that's predominantly what I lead, any kind of strain of thought related to the breath or related to ways of perceiving my felt experience, I consider those skillful, or anything that contributes to my mind being more at ease during that. I consider that skillful. Anything that distracts the mind and causes the mind to wander off, I would consider it unskillful, even if it doesn't have a strong negative charge to it. If it's preventing mindfulness of whatever the object of meditation is, then I would consider it for those purposes an unskillful quality. So, what do I more specifically, what do I mean by that is the reason in the beginning of the before we started the meditation that I said that it's not good to develop a habit of just cutting every thought down as it arises, because sometimes there is insight in the thoughts. But to be really careful with that, to not think to not have a thought arise and then think, ooh, there might be some insight in this thought. Let me excavate it. Let me hop on that train. But sometimes a thought will arise like, um, just, what if the breath was fire? Right? Just some random thought that seems odd and seems like you're being distracted. You're in some fantasy, oh, the breath's fire. But then to stop and think, well, what if the breath was fire? And then using that perception in the same way that we perceive breath and awareness is one thing. What if the breath is like fire? And then what you would notice through that spontaneous thought that arose is that perceiving the breath like fire tends to, if maintained, it tends to warm the body up. It tends to change the felt experience. It tends to make us more invested in the meditation because we're experimenting with the meditation. We're exercising creativity with the meditation. So if certain thoughts may arise like that seem kind of left field, but if they relate to the meditation topic, there might be some use to them. You might stumble upon a perception that you'd never thought would apply to the practice. But when you stop, take a minute and think, would this apply? How could this apply? Oftentimes it does. Um, so I hope that helps. Yeah. Katie said she appreciates the handouts that we can review and take notes on. Um, Thank you for taking the time to do this for us. It's helpful for my journaling. The more I write and reflect, the more skillful I will become. Absolutely. I'll often mention that the journal's really important, is a really important aspect of the practice, especially when you're new to the practice, because um, you can look back on your progress. Sometimes because progress in the practice happens so gradually, so slowly, because we have a lot of baggage to work through, that we can tend to not notice that change over time, right? So when we have the journal, we can look back and be like, wow, I used to be super reactive according to my journal compared to how I am now. Even though how I am now, I would still consider super reactive. It pales in comparison to how I used to be, things like that. And also to be able to take notes of certain perceptions, like I was mentioning with, oh, what if the breath is fire and things like that, to take notes of those. Today, I tried applying this perception in the meditation. It had a positive effect. Today, I tried using this perception in the meditation. It had a less desirable effect. And being able to create a journal, um, I don't have a traditional journal, but what I do have is a tension mapping journal where certain emotions correspond, certain patterns of tension in the body tend to give rise to certain mind states. And for everyone, this is different. And the one I always share is, for me, anger starts as tension in the shoulders, works its way down the arm, and becomes a fist, because that was my habitual tendency for years when I got angry, was to punch a person or a wall or whatever. Um, so that's the pattern of tension, the habitual pattern of tension. And it's not, what I noticed is it's not until the fist is actually tense that the anger rises in the mind. First, the suggestion is planted, the shoulders get tight, but it's not until it becomes a fist that anger arises in the mind. So by relaxing that pattern of tension, it prevents anger from arising in the first place. Seeds won't grow if you don't water them. So, yeah, journals, excellent. I'm glad you're finding the handouts helpful. And then I had one question that I was asked over text about last week's class, and I wanted to answer it now, because last week I talked about how right view is a belief in the principle of karma, um, but it's not asking you to believe in, to just have blind faith in past lives. Karma, a belief in karma or conviction in karma in a simpler sense, means a conviction in the belief that your actions have consequences, and that through your own positive thoughts, words, and deeds, you can change your mind. You have that neuroplasticity. Through positive thoughts, words, and deeds, you can change the inclination of the mind. Just as in that sutra that we just read, the mind becomes bent by that type of thinking. It inclines more towards skillful thoughts. So the question was asked to me of, they shared that it's difficult for them to embrace the concept of past lives. They're struggling with that a bit. And that it was refreshing that I had shared that belief in karma isn't dependent on a belief in past lives, or functionally using karma isn't dependent on a belief in past lives. They asked, if it's possible to follow a Buddhist path without having to embrace the belief in past lives and reincarnation. Is this a realistic wish? And are there any schools of Buddhism that don't require a belief in physical reincarnation? So, I have a few things to say on that. One, is it a realistic wish? Absolutely. You can follow this practice however you want to follow this practice. There's not really anything being forced on you. Uh, there are perceptions of certain things being more efficient and less efficient for the practice to develop. In terms of the, well, I'll cover the schools of Buddhism that don't focus on past life or don't talk about past lives as a core of them. One is, I believe, humanistic Buddhism. Doesn't really focus on the past life aspect. It focuses more on the reincarnation aspect being more of a mental phenomena. And then there's also secular Buddhism. Um, it's personally not something that was alluring to me, so I don't know very much about it. But secular Buddhism, in effect, is Buddhism stripped of kind of the Indian cultural beliefs of the Buddhist time, in favor of more of the pragmatic and direct aspects of the Buddhist teaching. That being said, there is a real benefit to and a real richness to some of these cosmological beliefs and these beliefs in rebirth. The interesting thing to mention too is there's not really within my own practice, there's not really with my own exploration, there's not a school of Buddhism that says in order to have right view, you have to believe in past lives or anything like that. And it's more of when we talk about sadhana or faith or conviction in the Buddha's teachings, when we're talking about faith in karma or faith in rebirth, we use the word faith in the West, but the closer translation is conviction. So faith in Buddhism isn't the kind of blind faith that we're used to, or the believing over seeing. Faith in Buddhism is conviction because you've realized it to be true for yourself. Through your own practice, through your own experimentation, you've realized it to be true. In the same way that conviction in karma, in the sense of your actions having consequences, we know that to be true because our actions tend to have consequences. Um, Conviction in rebirth is something that's you don't have to worry about really at all until much later down the path. Conviction in rebirth, traditionally within like the Pali Canon and stuff, doesn't really occur until someone in deep meditation recollects past lives. And then they're said to have conviction in rebirth. But they didn't have blind faith beforehand. They often take it as a working hypothesis. They take it on, if this principle is true, operating from this principle may be beneficial throughout the practice. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah. So if comfortable, please join palms, and we'll close in a transfer of merit. May all beings in all directions, without limit or exception, be healthy, safe, joyful, and at ease. May we all be healthy, safe, joyful, and at ease. May any merit gained from this practice be dedicated to all beings without limit or exception. Metta karuna mudita upeka sahanga taya cetasa chaturi sambharatva viharati samabodharo pavena samadamaro pavena sabha sangharo pavena sote hantu nirantaram. Bye now, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night, and I'll see you next week.